The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, murmurs dying down as the bailiff called the next case. People shifted in their seats, eyes turning toward the defendant's table. A woman in her 30s, wearing a faded dress and worn-out shoes, stood holding her son's hand. Her name was Maya Thompson, a single mother, accused of illegally withholding rent payments. Her eyes were tired, shoulders heavy with weeks of stress. But beside her stood her son, just 7 years old, his chin high, eyes wide with a kind of bravery that only innocence can bring. The judge, a stern but fair man named Judge Martinez, looked up from his bench. He expected to see an attorney step forward, someone later perhaps unfamiliar. Instead, he saw a little boy, no taller than the desk, wearing an oversized navy blue suit clearly borrowed from a relative. The sleeves swallowed his wrists, and his tie was crooked, but his presence stopped everyone cold. Before the judge could speak, the boy stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, "Your Honor, I'm here to represent my mom." A hushed silence fell over the room. Someone in the back chuckled softly, but it was quickly stifled. Judge Martinez blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, son, could you repeat that?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. The boy gripped the folder he held tighter and repeated, louder this time, "I'm representing my mom today. I'm her lawyer." The courtroom was still, stunned by the boldness of this child. Reporters in the back shifted in their seats, suddenly paying closer attention. The prosecutor turned with a confused scowl, scanning the room for hidden cameras or a prank. But there was no joke. There was only this tiny boy, standing between his mother and a system too big for either of them. Maya knelt beside her son, whispering urgently, "Baby, you don't have to do this. We'll find another way." But the boy just shook his head. "You always said to speak up for what's right. That no one should be silent when the truth can help." She blinked through tears, heart aching. She had said those things. She just never imagined her son would take them so literally, or so bravely. Judge Martinez studied the scene. His courtroom was no place for games, but something about the boy's calm demeanor and the pain on the mother's face told him this wasn't a stunt. He cleared his throat. "Young man, do you understand what a lawyer does?" he asked gently, not mocking but cautious. The boy nodded. "A lawyer helps someone tell the truth and makes sure people listen, even when they don't want to." Murmurs rose again. A woman in the front row smiled faintly, others shook their heads in disbelief. But no one laughed now. The judge tapped his gavel once. "And what's your name?" "Jaden Thompson." "Well, Mr. Thompson, this is highly irregular. But I'll allow you to speak, for now. What do you have to say in your mother's defense?" Jaden stepped forward, balancing the folder in his arms. His small hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing papers he had gathered himself, printed photos, handwritten notes, receipts copied from the fridge, and even drawings he had done to show a timeline. It was a child's version of a legal brief, but it was careful, organized, and filled with love. He looked up at the judge and said, "My mom pays our rent every month. But our landlord wants us out because he wants to raise the rent. He says she didn't pay, but I saw her hand him the money." The judge leaned back, surprised by the clarity of the boy's claim. Jaden pointed across the room. "He's lying," he said of the landlord, who now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He said no one would believe us. But I believe my mom. And I think the truth matters." The courtroom had never been so quiet. For the first time that day, people were listening, not just hearing, but truly listening. A child had walked into a place of power and dared to speak. Not for himself, but for someone he loved. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just in the case, but in the hearts of those watching. Judge Martinez sat back in his high-backed leather chair, his brow furrowed as he took in the strange scene before him. A child, a boy no older than 7, had just declared himself his mother's legal representative. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. The judge had seen plenty in his decades behind the bench. Hardened criminals break down in tears, lawyers buckle under pressure, witnesses recant and confess. But never had a child stood in front of him, suit and all, requesting to defend his mother in a courtroom of law. He adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, his voice steady but marked with curiosity. "Son," he said, "do you know what being a lawyer really means? This is not pretend. This is a courtroom. What happens here affects people's lives." The boy nodded without hesitation. His name was Jayden. His hands, still clinging to the folder of crumpled papers and notes, trembled slightly but didn't waver. "I know what it means, Your Honor," he said with quiet firmness. "It means I have to tell the truth, and I have to show the truth. It means I have to speak up for my mom because nobody else will." A hush fell over the room again, not from disbelief anymore, but from respect. It was clear Jayden wasn't joking. There was no sign of mockery or play acting in his voice. Just raw determination and a child's unfiltered sense of justice. The judge exhaled, then glanced down at his notes. The eviction case was already riddled with inconsistencies. Maya Thompson had lived in the building for over 6 years, paid rent on time, worked 2 jobs, and had no prior complaints. Yet suddenly she was being accused of non-payment with no formal warning. Something didn't sit right. Still, this wasn't a courtroom that typically entertained schoolchildren with hand-drawn timelines and crayon-colored facts. "Where is your mother's attorney?" Judge Martinez asked, glancing briefly toward the empty seat next to Maya. She looked up and spoke softly. "I couldn't afford one," she said. "I tried to get legal aid, but there's a waiting list. I thought I could represent myself, but," she paused, glancing at her son. "Jayden insisted on helping. He said if I couldn't have a lawyer, then he'd be mine." The judge let the silence stretch for a moment, weighing his options. Letting a child speak in court was a legal minefield. But shutting him down felt equally wrong. There was something undeniably powerful about the way Jayden stood there, small, alone, yet unshaken. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing an odd moment. It was witnessing something bigger. A child pushing back against a world that had made itself too complicated, too cold for people like his mother. "I'll allow him to speak," Judge Martinez finally said, the words falling like thunder across the silent courtroom. "But only as a witness. This is still a court of law. The rules apply to everyone." Jayden's face lit up with something more than happiness. It was relief, mixed with a quiet pride. He nodded solemnly and clutched his folder tighter. "You may proceed," the judge said. "What do you want this court to know?" Jayden stepped forward, his shoes clicking awkwardly on the polished wood floor. He stood beside the table where his mother sat, then turned toward the judge. "My mom didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I've seen her count every dollar. I was with her when she handed Mr. Reynolds, our landlord, the rent money. He said, 'Thanks,' and gave her a receipt. We still have it." He fumbled through his folder, carefully pulling out a wrinkled piece of paper. It wasn't the original receipt, just a photocopy his mom had made for safety. He passed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The judge looked over the paper, nodding slowly. "It's dated, and it matches the month in question," he murmured. "Interesting." Jayden wasn't finished. "He wants us to move because he wants to charge more money to new people. That's what he said on the phone." The judge looked up. "You heard him say that?" Jayden nodded. "I recorded it." The boy reached into his jacket pocket and held up an old digital recorder. The courtroom collectively leaned forward. The judge stared at him, stunned again. "Did anyone help you with this?" "No, sir," Jayden said. "I just didn't want us to lose our home." In that moment, the courtroom wasn't looking at a child anymore. They were looking at a fierce advocate, young, yes, but deeply aware of right and wrong. And as Judge Martinez set the recorder aside and leaned back once again, he realized this wasn't a simple eviction case anymore. This was a test of justice itself, and justice, it seemed, had found a voice in the most unexpected place. Jayden stood in the center of the courtroom, his small figure dwarfed by the polished wood and towering ceilings around him. But in that moment, he didn't look small. He looked steady, his eyes focused, his hands carefully opening the folder he had brought from home. It was worn and bulging, filled with loose papers, receipts, and notes he had gathered with the same attention some lawyers give to high-profile cases. The courtroom remained silent, not out of amusement anymore, but from an intense and growing curiosity. "I brought proof," he said, his voice clear. "I know I'm just a kid, but I saw what happened. And I have things to show you." He walked carefully to the front of the courtroom, stopping near the bailiff, who looked to the judge for direction. Judge Martinez gave a small nod, and the bailiff gently took the papers from Jayden's hands. As he brought them to the judge's bench, Jayden continued speaking. "My mom paid the rent. She always does. Sometimes we didn't have enough for a lot of things, but rent was the most important. We would even skip groceries to make sure we had enough. The judge flipped through the papers, photocopies of receipts, dates written in blue ink, and even a color printout of a photograph showing Maya handing an envelope to the landlord in the apartment hallway. The image was slightly blurry, likely taken on an old phone, but it was clear enough to show faces and gestures. Maya, looking tired but polite. Mr. Reynolds, the landlord, with his hand reaching out. Where did you get this photo? Judge Martinez asked, his voice more curious than stern. I took it, Jayden said simply. I didn't think I'd need it for anything serious. I just thought it was cool that my mom paid all by herself that day, even though we were struggling. In the gallery, someone let out a quiet sigh. Others shifted in their seats, now visibly invested. It was hard to ignore the raw truth in Jayden's words, not coached, not dramatic, just honest. That honesty cut through the usual legal posturing like a sharp blade. Jayden pulled out another paper, this one colored with crayons. It was a timeline, red and blue arrows, dates, and stick figures. It showed the sequence of events as he remembered them. The judge held it in his hands and studied it for a long moment. Despite its childish appearance, it was shockingly accurate. Jayden pointed at it from across the room. This was when we gave Mr. Reynolds the rent, he said, tapping the paper. And this was when he came back and said we didn't. But I remember because that same day, we didn't have money for dinner. We had cereal and water. The room fell silent again, the weight of that sentence hitting harder than any lawyer's closing argument ever could. The landlord, sitting across the aisle with his attorney, shifted uncomfortably. His smug expression had faded, replaced with a stiffness that suggested growing concern. He whispered something to his lawyer, who didn't respond. The judge looked up again. You said earlier your mother received a receipt. Jayden nodded. Yes, but it was in her purse, and it got wet when the roof leaked during the rain. But she took a picture of it before that. I printed the photo at the library. He held up another page, and again the bailiff retrieved it and handed it over. Judge Martinez examined it. Though slightly faded and creased, it showed a clear date, the amount paid, and a signature resembling Mr. Reynolds. He rubbed his chin, then glanced toward the landlord. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice level, does this look familiar to you? The landlord hesitated. I'd have to verify it, he stammered. Anyone could make a fake receipt. But would a child? The judge asked, narrowing his eyes. The room collectively leaned in. Jayden didn't flinch. He looked right at the landlord and said, you said no one would believe us because we're poor. You said it doesn't matter. But it does. It always matters. There was no anger in his voice, just quiet conviction. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just hearing evidence. They were hearing a plea for justice, not from a lawyer in a tailored suit, but from a boy who had witnessed truth and refused to let it be buried. Judge Martinez gently placed the crayon timeline on the bench, his fingers tapping against it thoughtfully. He didn't speak yet, but the look in his eyes said it all. Jayden hadn't just presented evidence. He had shaken the very core of the case. The courtroom had never seen anything like it. As Jayden stood facing the landlord's attorney, a tall man in a sharp gray suit named Mr. Blake, there was a noticeable shift in energy. Jayden didn't flinch. He clutched his folder to his chest, then walked to the center of the room with the same seriousness as someone 5 times his age. His voice was soft but unwavering as he turned toward the man who had been smirking all morning. I have a question, Jayden said, surprising everyone, including Judge Martinez. The judge raised an eyebrow but allowed the moment to continue. Proceed, he said cautiously. Jayden looked up at Mr. Blake. Did you see my mom hand the money to your client? Mr. Blake looked confused for a moment. He had expected emotion or tears from the boy, not this calm, focused question. No, I wasn't there, he said with a slight chuckle. I don't live in their building, young man. Jayden nodded. So you're just trusting what Mr. Reynolds told you. The lawyer straightened. I trust my client, yes. Jayden tilted his head, thoughtful. Even without proof. There were murmurs in the gallery. Mr. Blake's smirk faded. That's how client-attorney relationships work, he said stiffly, clearly thrown off by the directness. Jayden didn't argue. He simply moved to the next point. My mom paid him. I saw her. I have photos. I have copies of the receipts. But you're trying to get us kicked out just because your client said something. Isn't that unfair? The judge shifted in his chair, watching intently. Mr. Blake remained silent for a moment before answering. We're following the law. Jayden took a breath. But if the law doesn't listen to the truth, is it still justice? A stunned silence followed. No one expected a child to speak like that, not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity and challenge. The courtroom, normally filled with legal jargon and cold procedure, now felt deeply human. People leaned forward, completely drawn in. The judge looked down at his notes, but his eyes soon wandered back to Jayden. Do you have more questions? He asked. Jayden nodded. He pointed at the landlord, Mr. Reynolds, who now looked pale and nervous. Why didn't you give us a warning? Why didn't you tell the truth about the payment? Mr. Reynolds shifted, clearly uncomfortable. We gave verbal notices, he muttered. Jayden didn't miss a beat. Then why didn't you write it down? We have a lease. The lease says you have to give written notice before eviction. Judge Martinez leaned forward, flipping through the file again. He's correct, he said. A written notice must be served. There's no record of that in this file. Mr. Reynolds's lawyer quickly interjected. Perhaps it was lost or misfiled. No, Jayden interrupted. There wasn't one. You know there wasn't, because you wanted us gone fast. The landlord's lawyer tried to dismiss him. With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't think it's appropriate to let a child conduct cross-examination. But Judge Martinez raised a hand. He's not cross-examining in the legal sense. He's speaking as a witness and a concerned party. And quite frankly, he's asking the very questions I would be. The room remained silent again. No one dared interrupt. Jayden looked at the lawyer one last time. If you knew your client lied, would you still keep helping him? The lawyer's face stiffened. He didn't answer. Jayden turned and walked back to the defendant's table, standing beside his mom. She pulled him into a tight embrace, whispering, "You're doing more than I ever could." Across the room, the landlord sat stiffly, visibly shaken. For the first time, he looked like a man who had underestimated his opponent, and that opponent was a little boy who spoke the truth without flinching. Judge Martinez tapped his gavel once. I believe we've heard more than enough for today. We'll resume shortly. Court is in recess. As the room began to stir, people whispered, not out of disbelief anymore, but out of admiration. Jayden hadn't just asked good questions. He had exposed cracks in a case built on assumptions and lies. And he had done it not with a degree or experience, but with honesty, memory, and the courage to speak when no one else would. In that courtroom, at least for a moment, truth had a new voice, and it belonged to a child. Maya sat quietly at the defendant's table, her hands clenched in her lap as she watched her son speak with more strength than she had ever seen in him. Her heart swelled with pride, but it also ached. No mother wants to see her child standing in a courtroom, fighting battles meant for adults. She had tried so hard to protect him from this world, from the stress, the fear, the injustice. But life hadn't given her that luxury. And now, here he was, defending her with more courage and composure than most grown men. As Jayden finished his final question to the landlord's lawyer and returned to his seat, he glanced at her, his eyes searching for something. She smiled faintly and nodded, but her throat tightened. When he sat beside her, she gently pulled him into her arms. He leaned into her chest without hesitation. Despite the calm front he had shown the court, she could feel his little heart pounding. I'm so proud of you, she whispered into his ear, her voice barely audible. Jayden didn't say anything right away. He simply held her tighter. Across the room, the gallery had gone still. Those who had walked in expecting a routine eviction case now sat on the edge of their seats, quietly moved by what they were witnessing. No one had expected this child to speak with such clarity, such raw honesty. But even more than that, no one had expected the emotional weight that now hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about legal documents and landlord claims anymore. This was about survival, dignity, and the bond between a mother and her son. Maya's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them quickly, trying to stay composed, but it was no use. Years of holding back emotion, of staying strong for her child, of weathering every storm that life threw at them, it all began to break loose. And not from sadness, from pride, from disbelief, from overwhelming love. She looked down at her son. You shouldn't have to do this, she whispered. You should be playing outside, reading books, dreaming big. Not defending your mama in court. Jayden looked up at her. But I want to, he said simply. I didn't want them to lie and win. You always tell me to speak up, to be brave. I just did what you taught me. That was it. The dam broke. Maya turned her face away for a moment, her shoulders shaking silently as tears ran down her cheeks. There was no sobbing, no wailing, just quiet, unstoppable emotion. She wasn't crying from weakness. She was crying from the weight of it all. From watching her child become the very thing she had always dreamed he'd be, strong, kind, brave, but much sooner than he should have had to. The courtroom watched in respectful silence. Even the judge had paused in his notes, his pen resting on the edge of his legal pad. He had seen many mothers cry in court, some from guilt, some from loss. But this was different. This was the quiet unraveling of a woman who had carried too much for too long and was finally seeing someone lift the burden, if only for a moment. A woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man beside her whispered, "That boy, he's something else." Heads nodded in agreement, no longer seeing Jaden as just a child, but as a symbol of something much deeper, the quiet resilience of the people society overlooks, and the unimaginable strength that love can create. Maya eventually composed herself, sitting up straighter, wiping her cheeks, and brushing Jaden's hair back from his forehead. She kissed the top of his head and whispered, "No matter what happens, you already won. You understand me." Jaden nodded without hesitation. Across the room, the landlord shifted uncomfortably, watching this moment unfold, realizing that the story he had tried to paint, of an irresponsible tenant-making excuses, had unraveled completely. In its place stood something far more powerful, the undeniable truth spoken through the tears of a mother and the voice of a child who refused to be ignored. And in that courtroom, for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel cold or distant. It felt personal, real, human. After a brief recess, the courtroom reconvened. The room was still, everyone waiting for what came next. Judge Martinez returned to the bench with a heavy file in his hand and a thoughtful expression on his face. He glanced down at the papers Jaden had submitted, crayon timelines, photocopied receipts, a blurry photo of the rent exchange, and then back at the landlord and his attorney. The judge's fingers tapped rhythmically on the bench. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. Jaden sat beside his mother, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. Maya, though still visibly emotional, had regained her composure. She kept one hand gently on her son's back. She had spent so long feeling powerless in this system, buried beneath bills and bureaucracy, that she never expected her child would be the one to finally make someone listen. The judge cleared his throat and spoke, his voice deliberate and measured. "I have reviewed the materials presented by the defendant's son, Mr. Jaden Thompson." He paused, eyes flicking to the boy, who sat up straighter in his chair. "And I must say, in all my years of service, I have never encountered something quite like this." The courtroom held its breath. "The evidence may not be traditionally formatted," Judge Martinez continued, holding up Jaden's color-coded timeline. "But it is organized, consistent, and, most importantly, credible. This child has demonstrated not only an understanding of the facts, but a remarkable ability to communicate them with clarity and honesty." He looked toward the plaintiff's side. "Mr. Reynolds," he said to the landlord, "your case rests on a claim that the defendant did not pay rent for the month in question. However, you have provided no written notice, no receipts, no verifiable documentation, only your word." The landlord shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth, but the judge held up his hand. "In contrast, the defense has presented photographic evidence of the exchange, a digital record of a conversation suggesting motive, and a scanned receipt bearing your signature. While I will not make a ruling on criminal charges at this time, I must say your credibility is deeply in question." A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. "Therefore," the judge said firmly, "I find in favor of the defendant, Maya Thompson. The eviction notice is hereby dismissed, effective immediately." The room erupted into stunned silence, then a burst of quiet cheers from a few members of the gallery. Maya gasped softly, pressing her hand to her mouth. Jaden turned to her, eyes wide, and she pulled him into her arms. There was no need for words between them in that moment. He had done it. He had saved their home. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he added, "I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for review. There are grounds to investigate potential perjury and unlawful eviction attempts on the part of the plaintiff." Justice is not a game, and the courtroom is not a place for manipulation. Mr. Reynolds turned pale. His lawyer quickly gathered their papers, whispering frantically. The judge ignored them, turning instead back to Jayden. Mr. Thompson, he said with a rare smile breaking through his formal demeanor, you reminded us today of something we sometimes forget, that the law is not just about documents and rules. It's about people. It's about truth. And sometimes, it takes someone outside the system to remind us what justice really looks like. Jayden blinked, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to praise from strangers, certainly not from someone so important. The judge continued, you're not a lawyer today, son. But one day, if you still want to be, I hope I see you in this courtroom again, on the right side of the bench. The gallery clapped quietly. Even the bailiff gave a small nod of approval. Maya looked at her son with tear-filled eyes. He will be, she whispered. Jayden looked up at her, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small smile. And just like that, it was over. But no one in the room would forget what they had witnessed. A child had stood in a courtroom and changed everything, not with power, not with position, but with truth, love, and courage. Justice had spoken, and it had come from the most unexpected voice of all. Outside the courthouse, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the buildings, casting long golden shadows across the steps. The crowd that had gathered inside now spilled onto the sidewalk, buzzing with conversation, phones in hand, reporters rushing to set up microphones and cameras. What had started as a quiet eviction hearing had turned into something else entirely, a moment that no one could ignore. Jayden and Maya emerged hand in hand from the heavy double doors, blinking into the light. As soon as they appeared, reporters swarmed, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Jayden, how did you learn all this? Maya, did you know your son would speak today? Do you think the landlord will be charged? Jayden, do you want to be a lawyer when you grow up? Jayden froze, eyes wide at the sudden attention. Cameras pointed in every direction. He instinctively stepped closer to his mom, gripping her hand tighter. Maya looked down at him and gave a reassuring squeeze. She wasn't used to the spotlight either, but somehow, in this moment, she found strength in her son's composure, because even through the noise, Jayden didn't shrink. He just breathed in, stood straight, and nodded. A young reporter with a press badge knelt slightly to his level. Jayden, is it true you acted as your mom's lawyer today? Jayden looked at her and answered plainly. I'm not really a lawyer. Not yet. But no one else was going to speak for her. I just said the truth. Another camera clicked. A different reporter leaned in. Where did you learn how to present like that? My mom always said to stand up for what's right, he replied. Even if you're the only one standing. A hush fell over the crowd for a beat, then a swell of admiration followed. A few reporters lowered their microphones. It wasn't just a good quote, it was real. And in that authenticity, Jayden had done something rare, he'd made people listen. Not just with his words, but with the way he carried them, with quiet conviction, not showmanship. Maya gently pulled him in, shielding him slightly from the growing crowd. That's enough questions, she said softly. He's just a boy. But one reporter asked, Maya, what's next for you and your son? She paused, looked down at Jayden, and then back at the reporter. What's next? We go home. We cook dinner. We breathe. And maybe, she added with a faint smile, we celebrate a little. Behind them, a woman in a suit approached. She was holding a card in her hand and wore the badge of a local nonprofit legal advocacy group. She smiled at Maya. Ms. Thompson, I'm with Community Justice Alliance. We saw what happened today. We'd like to help, pro bono. Legal support, housing protection, and maybe even a scholarship program for your son. If you're interested. Maya's eyes widened. You're serious? Very, the woman said. We need voices like his in law someday. And voices like yours in the world. Now. Maya took the card with trembling fingers, then glanced down at Jayden, who looked confused but hopeful. What's pro bono? He whispered. It means help without asking for anything back, she said softly, then turned to the woman. Yes, we're interested. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Jayden looked back at the courthouse, its tall columns, its heavy doors, its walls that had once felt so cold and unreachable. Now, it felt different. Like a place where he had left his mark. Not because he had power, or experience, or money, but because he had the truth. As they walked away from the crowd, Maya wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders. "You were amazing today. I was scared," he admitted. "That's what makes it brave," she said. And in that quiet moment, away from the microphones, the flashing lights, the buzzing voices, the story became more than a headline. It became a memory, a turning point, a promise that even in a world stacked against them, they could still win. Together. Weeks had passed since the courtroom turned into a stage for something far greater than a simple legal dispute. The story of Jaden Thompson, the 7-year-old boy who defended his mother against eviction, had swept through the local news and then quickly spread across the country. Clips of his courtroom speech aired on national television. Online articles shared screenshots of his crayon-colored timeline and the photo he had taken of his mother handing the landlord the red money. People everywhere were talking about the little boy who stood up and reminded the world what justice should look like. But inside their modest apartment, things moved more slowly. Maya still got up at 6 a.m. to make breakfast before heading to work at the diner. Jaden still sat at the kitchen table each night, doing his homework in the same worn-out notebook he'd used all year. Their life hadn't changed overnight, but the world around them had begun to notice. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to Jaden in neat, bold lettering. Maya watched from the kitchen as he opened it carefully, eyebrows furrowing at the gold seal on the paper inside. "What's that, baby?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Jaden held it out to her. "It's from a law school." Maya raised her eyebrows in surprise, taking the letter and reading it aloud. "Greater than, to Mr. Jaden Thompson. On behalf of the admissions committee at Eastwood University School of Law, we extend our deepest admiration for the extraordinary courage and clarity you demonstrated in defense of your mother. While you are many years away from college, we would be honored to offer you a full scholarship to our program, should you choose to pursue a legal education with us in the future. Keep speaking up. The world needs your voice." She stared at the letter for a long moment before slowly sinking into a chair. "A law school," she whispered. Jaden shrugged shyly. "I guess they think I did okay." "You did more than okay," Maya said, pulling him into a hug. "You changed everything." In the following days, more offers and messages came. Nonprofits reached out offering housing support and legal guidance. A local law firm started a mentorship program in Jaden's name, inviting young students to learn about justice, evidence, and advocacy. Even a children's book publisher contacted Maya, asking for the rights to tell Jaden's story in a way that could inspire kids everywhere. Through all of it, Jaden remained grounded. He wasn't in it for fame or attention. What mattered to him was simple: that his mom was safe, that their home was still theirs, and that the truth had been heard. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching the news, the anchor mentioned his name again. And that's why Jaden Thompson has become a symbol of courage across the country, reminding all of us that justice doesn't depend on age, size, or title. It depends on heart. Jaden blushed and turned away from the screen. "They're still talking about it." Maya nodded. "Of course they are. You did something people don't forget." He looked at her with wide eyes. "Do you think I really could be a lawyer someday?" She reached over and took his hand. "Baby, I think you already are. You've got the heart for it. The rest is just training." Jaden leaned against her shoulder, tired from school and the whirlwind of attention, but content. Outside, the city lights flickered, and life kept moving. But inside their home, there was peace, hard-earned, deeply felt. And even though the world had given him titles like hero and future attorney, Jaden didn't care about any of that. He was just a boy who loved his mom and wanted to make things right. That was enough. One day, he might stand in a courtroom again, older, taller, dressed in a real lawyer's suit, backed by degrees and training. But whether or not that day came, what he did in that moment, on that day in court, would remain etched in hearts forever. Because justice hadn't come from a law book. It had come from the courage of a child who believed that truth, no matter how small the voice, deserved to be heard.